Today we're going to cover Chapter 2, Section 2. So we're making our way through Chapter 2, which is about all of the early river valley civilizations. And where we stop today is at the Nile River and ancient Egypt. So Roman numeral 1 is geography of Egypt. We'll talk a little bit about the geographic base. It's centered on the Nile River. Obviously, the Nile River is the longest river in the world. It does flow to the north from East Africa and then empties into the Mediterranean Sea. The water source for the Nile comes from the distant mountains in Egypt and the plateaus and lakes in that region. Now, this river was coined the gift of the Nile by the famous Greek historian Herodotus. One of the key things to understand about the Nile is, like the Tigris and Euphrates that we learned about in Section 1, it floods yearly. And then when that river recedes, goes back to the normal width, it leaves behind that rich soil called silt. Every year, in Egypt, though, we know that it happens in July. In July, there's rain, there's melting snow from the mountains. This causes the flooding. So the river would then recede each year in October, which would leave behind that rich deposit of black, fertile mud called silt. And then that's when you would plant your crops, if wheat and barley and other things, in that strip of land that was highly irrigated by the silty soil. Now, we talked yesterday about some of the key, or I should say in Section 1, about some of the key things that a river brings to a civilization. But we also know that there are some environmental challenges here that we want to take into account. So the Nile's flooding was more predictable. That's a very positive thing. So if you're looking at a comparison between Egypt and Sumer, Egypt has the advantage as far as the predictable flood pattern of the river. They knew every July it was going to flood. It would go back generally in October. Now, here's the problem, though. There's still some challenges, even though you know when it's going to flood. If the river floods just a few feet lower than normal, the amount of silt available will be reduced. And so you're going to have a lot of people starving because they're planning on this much food being available. The population is at this rate. And so what happens is people will lose out on food. This could be catastrophic. If the floodwaters are just a few feet higher, it's going to spill out farther, and that could cause some damage to things like granaries, which are going to need to be put in spots close to the river in proximity to the fields. The Nile Valley is also surrounded by large deserts on all sides. Now, these form great natural barriers of defense. That's a positive. The downside to that, though, is that if people can't get to you, you also have a predicament in getting to them. So that limits your amount of long-distance trade. That was one of the other things that you want to think about as an environmental challenge in ancient Egypt. Next, we're going to talk about something that can confuse many students, and that is also a geographic ideology, the naming of Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is actually the southern portion. It's called Upper Egypt simply because it has a higher elevation on average. And then Lower Egypt is the area near the Mediterranean Sea. It's a little bit more flat. It also includes the Nile Delta region. And a delta is a broad, marshy, triangular area of land formed by deposits of silt running upward or northward in the river. So the Nile was definitely an advantage, but it did have some things that we want to consider as maybe challenges. I'm going to show you the geographic map here of what I'm talking about. This is the Nile Delta. It's where basically the Nile spills into the Mediterranean Sea. It's a pretty large triangular shaped area. This is it right here, a better view actually from the satellite. That's the Nile Delta, extremely fertile land right there due to the deposits of silt flowing upward in the river. Now, this would be Lower Egypt, where it's a little bit more flat, a little bit lower elevated. This is Upper Egypt. You can see there's some mountainous terrain here that would cause this river to flow to the north. There's also some mountainous terrain even further south in what is called Nubia here, which also continues that flow in a northward fashion. Okay, next we're going to talk a little bit more government and leadership in early Egypt. So Egypt unites into a kingdom, and that's going to be under the direction of King Narmer, sometimes referred to as the Scorpion King, sometimes referred to as Menes, M-E-N-E-S. So don't really have a great hold on some of these key figures because they're so old, and this is happening prior to 3000 BC, where writing is very rare. So King Narmer is generally credited, especially in your textbook, for connecting and uniting the separate kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt. This unification happened sometime around 3000 BC, but understand that Egyptians had been living in farming villages in northern Africa since 5000 BC, one of the oldest civilizations. So Narmer, he made his capital city at Memphis, Egypt, not Memphis, Tennessee, but Memphis, Egypt, which is roughly the spot where Lower and Upper Egypt meet. It's kind of right in the center there, and you can see that on the map that I showed you in the previous slide. Eventually, though, the history of ancient Egypt would consist of 31 separate dynasties and span over 2,600 years. The way that they referred to their rulers was as pharaohs. They saw their pharaohs as gods. To the pharaohs, they saw themselves as kings, but also they saw themselves as living gods, and they propagated this thought process to the people. So the pharaohs were considered Egyptian god kings. They were thought to be almost as powerful as the gods of the heavens. That's quite a bit of power. Theocracy, this is how the system worked. A theocracy is a type of government in which rule is based on religious authority. In this case, because the pharaoh is both the general ruler, but also seen as a god king, this is definitely an example of religious-based theocracy. Now, we should know that the Egyptians are generally credited with building the pyramids, and we know that they are still standing today. But what a lot of students don't know, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, sophomores, that these pyramids were simply tombs. They are necessary because the Egyptians believed in the afterlife, and they believed that their pharaoh ruled even after his death. Because of this, the tombs were actually more important than the places of living called palaces that the kings had. So they spent their entire lifetime designing their tomb or pyramid. The pyramid is simply the resting place for kings after death. And it is also an immense structure. It's very large, and it takes a great undertaking to build and construct. Most of the pyramids in Egypt were constructed in the Old Kingdom, which spanned from 2660 to 2180 BC. This was known as the Age of Pyramid Building. So this is the time period when you see the pyramids at Giza, other pyramids, this is the time period in which those were constructed. Egyptians did have a plentiful supply of stone in the form of granite and also limestone, and they used that to construct these pyramids. One thing that I want to focus on with the pyramids, I'm not going to get into the pyramids too much, but what it shows is that Egyptian civilization was strong. The fact that they could create these meant that they had the economic, the technological, and the governmental means to support these massive works projects. Now, we know that they did have slavery too, which is a terrible institution, and the Egyptians put slaves to work sometimes on pyramids, but mostly on other projects. Roman numeral number 3 is going to talk about Egyptian culture. Yet in section 1, we talked about Sumerian culture. They were also polytheistic. They believed in many gods. In fact, they worshiped over 2,000 gods and goddesses. I think that would be quite hard to remember all of those. But religion was a premium, so they had to focus on that. They did believe in an afterlife. What they believed is that you would be judged based on what you did while you were alive. They have this whole story about having a scale, and they'll put your heart on the scale, and however it tipped the scale would determine how joyous of an afterlife you were going to have. So it kind of was connected to what you did while you were alive, how well or joyous your afterlife would be. Now, people of all classes in Egypt planned for their burials. They had a planned burial. Kings and queens, of course, built the elaborate tombs called pyramids. Now, the royal and elite bodies, the very wealthy, the very powerful, they preserved their bodies through a process called mummification. Mummification is simply the embalming and the drying of a corpse to prevent decay. It's usually a 2-day process, and it involves coating the body with honey, removing the organs. So the Egyptians, because of this process of mummification, they really understood human anatomy, and they were really known as some of the first medical doctors. Very important objects and items that a person used in the real world would be taken with them in their tombs to the afterlife, like clothing, food, cosmetics, jewelry. Sometimes they would take their pets. Even pharaohs would sometimes take their royal guard, like maybe 25 of their best soldiers would be forced to guard their tomb until they died on their own in the pyramid. Next is Roman numeral number 4, life in the Egyptian society. We'll talk a little bit about the social class system in Egypt. It's much like a pyramid, if you can see sort of the structure working downward at the very top, the people there are going to have the fewest in population. They're not going to have the numbers, but as you get down to the bottom, the pyramid expands. That's where your people have the highest population. So in the upper class, you've got groups like the king, the queen, the royal family. In the middle class, I should say pharaoh, okay, but I'm trying to explain it so that you'll understand it. Number two, the middle class would be merchants and artisans, much like in Sumer. The lower class would be your farmers and day laborers. A day laborer is somebody who moves things around or does general labor or work jobs. At the very bottom of the pyramid are slaves. Slaves for Egypt were generally captives of foreign wars. They served in generally the households of the rich or worked in gold mines in Upper Egypt. When we talk about mobility, what I'm talking about is social mobility. Can you move up or down in the social hierarchy or the social class? The thing about it is, in Egypt, they were not locked into their social class. You could achieve higher status through marriage or success in jobs or work or in your occupation. Some slaves could even earn their freedom from loyal service. The highest positions, though, were only available to people who could read and write. So you had to have a certain amount of wealth to become a scribe. You had to have a certain amount of wealth to learn to read and write at all. And the highest government positions were reserved for those who could read and write. Women, very important here. Like Sumer, very similar. Women had some of the same rights as men. They could own and trade property. One thing that I found interesting in doing some research here is that women could actually propose marriage or seek divorce. This is something that was kind of unheard of in other ancient civilizations, and even through the Middle Ages. Women had sort of power in marriage more so than in later civilizations. Basically, also, if they did get a divorce, the woman was entitled to about a third of the couple's property. So that's also something that is very rare. So a pretty close to equal footing in Egyptian gender roles. Capital letter D, we'll talk a little bit about their writing system. We learned that the first writing system in the history of the world that we have documented is from Sumer, called cuneiform. The Egyptians had their own version of that called hieroglyphics. It's an ancient Egyptian writing system. They used pictures that would represent ideas and sounds. Now, hieroglyphics was first written on stone or clay tablets until the invention of papyrus. Papyrus is an Egyptian invention. It's a tall plant. It grows in the Nile Delta region, and they use the large leaves from this plant. They dry it out, and it becomes a paper-like substance that you can write on. Now, it's green when it's growing and alive. Once you cut it down and it dies, that leaf's going to turn into a yellowish color. So if you talk about old papyrus scrolls or Egyptian scrolls, they're most likely made out of papyrus. And paper comes from that word. Next is science and technology. Like Sumer, the Egyptians had many innovations with science and technology. They developed a calendar. It was based on the stars. It had 12 months of 30 days, so extremely accurate, and it fell short of the true solar year by only 6 hours. Numbers. They had basic mathematics. They had counting, adding, subtracting. They had that in the plan. Mathematical knowledge, though, with those calculations helped engineers and architects construct pyramids and palaces and such. Architecture. They are the first to use stone columns in homes, palaces, and temples. And one of the things I want to highlight is medicine. Like I said, because they were working on mummification, they are some of the most famous doctors of the ancient world. They could perform things like checking your pulse. They understood that. They understood some minor surgeries, such as setting broken bones and removing organs during the mummification process. The final portion of this is when Egypt comes under the control of invaders. And this is going to end the Old Kingdom. So Egypt is divided into 3 kingdoms. There's the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and then the New Kingdom, which we'll learn about later in the year in chapter 4. But at the end of the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh's power sort of was wavering. It began to decline roughly 2180 BC, and weak rule took place for about 150 years after that point. The Middle Kingdom is then what happens next, and that's the time period from 2040 to 1640. This is when Egypt returned to power. Strong pharaohs regained control and restored law and order in Egypt. But then at the end of the Middle Kingdom, a foreign group called the Hyksos, which were from the Middle East, the Palestine region, came across the Isthmus of Suez, show you where that is in 1640. This would be the Isthmus of Suez right up here. Okay, this is the Suez Canal today. This is that region where they crossed over right here. Okay. The Hyksos, eventually called rulers of foreign lands, that's what that word means in Egyptian. They conquered the Egyptians, basically. They had some of the world's first war chariots, and then the Egyptians eventually adopted that from the Hyksos. But they ruled Egypt from 1630 to 1523. And then this is when the new kingdom begins. Egypt overthrew the Hyksos, knocking them out of power around 1520. And that was, when we come back to Egypt in a later chapter, the new kingdom is what we will talk about. Thank you.